My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is Spencer Dickinson, a candidate for the Democratic nomination to replace former Congressman David Cicilline, who left midterm to take a job in the private sector. Welcome back to State of the State.
I have been here before.
You have. On this side of the table as well as that side.
That's the truth. Full disclosure.
You are no stranger to the election campaign, having served 8 years in the legislature, including Deputy Majority Leader. And we are taping this program in what I call voting season. We no longer have...
By the way, just not to correct you, but 8 years living in District 1, 4 years living in District 2. So, okay. 12 years.
12, I'm sorry, did I, okay.
No, I can
12.
understand anyhow, go ahead.
Okay, well, we no longer have an election day, we have a voting season. And the field is crowded with, I believe, 12 Democrats vying for the party's nomination. The Sunday edition of the Providence Journal front page article was a written survey to these candidates. And the paper said you chose not to respond, and the newspaper said it spoke to you. Why did you refuse to participate?
You know, there may have been a little bit of not telling the whole story there by the reporter who may have an agenda. I think maybe that call reminding me of the deadline was maybe after the deadline. Does it count reminding you that? And by the way, I was riding with my friend Victor to the State House to be with the retirees who had their pension stolen on November 18th of 2011. And I thought it was very important to be with them. They were standing outside the governor's office. And so it was either that or go over to the Journal and make my appointment. I made a mistake by not calling them. But I was in the right place when I was in the State House, in effect, advocating for the retirees. And that's an interesting issue. It's very complicated.
Well, we're going to get to that, but I want your answers to why didn't you participate in the survey?
Well, that was a mistake. And although when I read
yours or theirs?
I read the thing. No, it was my mistake. It was my mistake and a little bit of deception on their part. You know, whenever they can, it looks to me as though they're spinning it to make me look bad, rather than saying, you know, they could have said, we called him and he was on his way to the State House because he has some friends over there that he wants to talk, you know, to be with. That wasn't in the article. Matter of fact, there was no reporter in the State House, no TV camera either, except Capitol TV inside the governor's office. There was no reporter covering the fact that there was a very loud demonstration by people who'd had their pensions virtually stolen from them. You know, on a footnote on that, in case somebody out there thinks that it's okay to steal pensions from teachers and state employees, how are you going to hire new teachers for the people that need them? I don't want to get ahead.
I'm going to give you plenty of time to address that because I know it's on your website. But I want you to tell the audience what separates you from the rest of the field, background-wise and qualifications.
You know, it's interesting because I was at one forum where there were 10 people at the table, and I was at the end. And the whole other 9 basically seemed to be climbing all over each other to avoid being me. And that was fine by me. That does distinguish me. I think maybe in some ways the voters have to make that determination. But I think that it's important to save the Democratic Party. We've got a 2-party system. It works. We could do a half an hour or an hour on why that's a good idea. But I'm an advocate of it. And every time the Democratic Party shoots itself in the foot, we lose our opportunity to talk about things we care about, which is Social Security, Medicaid for all, or something of that nature, global warming and rising sea level, and something that I think is extremely important that never gets talked about, and that is the fact that we've got the capacity and more likelihood with every passing day of blowing ourselves off the planet with a nuclear war. And there's some details about that which I'd like to talk about. And by the way, one of the things that distinguishes me is I think I understand these issues, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Middle East or nuclear power or the budget for our military. I know a lot about that stuff, and I'm willing, and if anybody ever knew me when I was on the Finance Committee, I think I know how to understand the numbers. They're much bigger at the federal level, but somebody's got to go there, and you don't get a quick course in, you know, you can get a briefing, but you don't get a quick course in the big picture of our military strength. It's really important. So that's my the fourth issue that I think are to me anyway, the key issues that make up the Democratic core values. And we're going to lose that if we give it away to the progressives. And I used to think I was kind of a progressive person, but I found out they wouldn't let me in the room. So in fact, one of the reasons I'm running is to return the party to, say, the JFK Democrats. And I'm not the only one doing that, but you know, that would be one of my goals.
So on the political spectrum, you place yourself as was being called a JFK or moderate type Democrat, as opposed to this progressive left, which is basically most of the field. There's you and I think one other candidate.
Seems to be.
Yeah. Now let's move on to this sort of a timely issue. Lieutenant Governor Sabina Matos was thought to be the leading candidate to replace Cicilline until news broke that boards of canvassers in 3 towns, Newport, East Providence, and started in Jamestown actually, they noticed irregularities in her certification papers, and some signatures were forged and a few were signed by people who had recently died. The Board of Elections initially tried to set this aside, but there was pressure from, I think, Channel 12's investigative reporters did a good job on that. They ended up reviewing every signature on her papers, and this showed that over 40% of the voters' signatures, over 40%, were invalid. Nevertheless, the Board of Elections is allowing Matos' name to remain on the ballot because even when these are removed, she has enough signatures to qualify. Do you think Sabina Matos should be on this ballot?
I think we have to follow the law, and I think that technically speaking, she's got the 500 signatures. Maybe you want to make a phone call to each of those people or send the sheriff down to make sure they exist. But I'm not sure that's the issue. I think the issue we ought to be looking at is, and this is for every voter, does she know how to hire staff? Is she going to hire forgers and fraudulent workers, you know, for her 2 years or however many years she's in? This is a 1-year term, but is she going to? Is this an example of the people she hires? I think she's got to take responsibility for that, and I think what she's telling me is, I don't know how to hire people.
Yeah, she initially said that the first person who was identified as collecting the signatures in Jamestown, she said she doesn't represent the campaign. She's a paid campaign worker, so obviously she represents the campaign. I mean,
that would be my reading of it.
So,
but I'm really sorry that we spent a month on talk radio or in the Village Green, whatever the circle is where we discuss these things. We've been talking about signatures for a month. We can't get anybody to talk about things that what I think really matter, like the candidate's ability to go to Washington and understand the issues, or the question of how we can save our state's reputation as an employer. You know, we're not going to be able to hire teachers if anybody considering that occupation says, well, they say they're going to give me a pension, but they're not, or they're going to allow inflation to cut up by 34% in 10 years, which is totally predictable. I'm not sure I like inflation. I'm not sure I like deficit spending, you know, without limits. But, and by the way, ask me about John Maynard Keynes sometime, or in the next minute or two.
Are you a Keynesian?
Yes and no. I'm half Keynesian, and here's the story. This is a brilliant economist who figured out and also quantified the question of, can you get rid of the dips in the economy by borrowing money and putting people to work on public projects? That's the essential issue. And I think the answer is yes, you can smooth out the economy. It has got dips. What the politicians forgot is every couple of years you got to pay that off. It's like drinking coffee and never taking a nap. You can't do that. That's what we're doing economically today. And, you know, I hate to say it, Republicans are the ones that are saying that. But, you know, how do you save the Democratic Party? You save the country and you stop doing this. Of course we should have public projects. There's one that I could mention, you know, maybe the road to Hartford. Doesn't matter what it is. We need our public projects, and it doesn't take a whole lot of timing to get it right. But I don't think Keynes said, keep borrowing money until you're dead, or keep drinking coffee until you know, get a heart attack. That's not what he said, and yet that's what people seem to think he said. By the way, if you spend money, you buy votes, and that's tempting. You know, by the way, I will not do that. I'll spend money, but I won't do it to buy votes.
Your campaign clearly has a great emphasis on the unfairness of the public employee pension reform that was passed when Gina Raimondo was general treasurer, and it's what propelled her to the governor's office and now on to a cabinet position in the Biden administration. You say on your website, if elected, you will hire an actuary on your congressional staff to review the entire pension system in Rhode Island.
Right.
Isn't this using a federal office to address a purely state issue? Are any other states dealing with this reform issue?
It depends on how you count it, but there are 47 or 48 states that have this problem. And one of the reasons it's so hard for us to address is that there are a lot of people out there that don't want it fixed. If you're sitting in New York hauling in a whole lot of money from the smallest state and a bunch of other states, you don't want this problem solved. And the way I see it, you can pick a number, 100 million, 200 million, but if money is going to some financial advisors, and this is what Ted Seidel says. By the way, he is an FEC lawyer who is also, I think they say he's the best known forensic auditor in the country. He's written a couple of books, and he said that the pension reform that happened in November of 2011 was basically a Wall Street coup. He said our pension system has fallen victim to a Wall Street coup. Now that's pretty strong wording. But I think, I've talked to him about this extensionally. I flew down to Florida a couple of years ago and sat in his beach house, and he gave me a lot of his time, explained his whole theory and what he's observed. He could prove this. He knows it. You don't have to be a genius to know what's going on the other side of a room when you're locked out. If you recognize the sounds, he can tell you what's happening, but he doesn't have the documents because the treasurer will not release the contracts with the financial advisors. Now that, in my opinion, is contrary to Rhode Island statute, but who's going to enforce that? Well, I will, I'll help enforce it if you elect me to Congress. One of the reason we need an auditor is because I've been very frustrated over the last 10 years. There's some lawsuits, there's some efforts to put in legislation to throw somebody $500 a year in hush money. That's not a COLA, a cost of living allowance, a dollar value adjustment. And one of the things I found in legislation is if you want legislation that's going to pass, you've got to cover the specifics. And unfortunately, the advocates in this state don't have the resources to do that. A couple of good actuaries in any office, particularly a congressional office, could do that. And by the way, the second part of my suggestion, you can ask me the question about that. In other words, I have a plan, and it's a two-part plan.
What's the second part?
It's not enough to bring in a piece of legislation. And by the way, you got to cross all the T's and and dot the I's, or a conscientious legislator can't vote for it. A 30-page bill with blank pages, you can't do that. You can't pass that. And unfortunately, we haven't had good legislation, in my opinion. But the rest of it is what motivates a legislature to correct this mistake. And somebody says, well, we got $34 million in school lunches, let's use that money. Somebody says we got $600 million in the till. Well, I don't know that that's true, but let's use that money. But before you make that decision, you better know how much, what are you buying? Are you buying something that costs $1 billion or $100 million, or what is it? And the answer, I will bring, and there's some legislators here in this state today that I've talked to, Democrats, my friends, they'll put the bill in. And they haven't absolutely promised me that they will, but I get that impression. So the point is, we'll have a bill without defects or darn close. And at that point, the Speaker, if he is a soldier of Gina Raimondo and in effect working for Wall Street, he's never going to let that through. And by the way, sue me about that, because we'll take depositions and we'll be way better off than we are today. I said it. There are people in the legislature today whose job it is to protect that thing that Ted Seidel called a coup by Wall Street. So how do you solve that? How do you change the view of the legislators and the public? And sadly, there's people in the public out there who don't think the teachers ought to get any pensions. But they don't understand that if you want a public school system, you've got to incentivize good young people to join the profession. And that also goes for state employees. And we're not going to have any of either if we keep this up. You can't make a promise. Promise them a $50,000 pension, and 10 years later, it'll only buy $30,000 worth of groceries. You can't do that.
Well, here's the question. Everybody's affected by inflation. The senior citizens say I'm living on, quote, fixed income, even though they get an adjustment if they're on Social Security, as you know.
Social Security has done the right thing.
Right.
They correct.
Correct. But here's the question. Should teachers and state workers be insulated from inflation, and how do we pay for that except that we turn to the private sector? Many people are not getting their salaries adjusted for inflation.
Most people are not, you're right.
Right, and so now we're going to turn to them and say, you got to pay more taxes so that the retired teachers and state workers and public employees will get a COLA?
Here's what's interesting about that. My guess, and I've got to see the numbers before I say this for sure, but my guess is the amount of money that's being stolen today, and I'm using that word, sue me for it, again, I'd like to take the depositions. That's taxpayers' money. It's going to the wrong place. If it were going to the right place, you'd have excess of money to pay the dollar value adjustment, also known as cost of living adjustment. And I was about to tell you about my plan for bringing this out, because I think if everybody knew what really happened, the public attitude would completely change and the legislature would do the right thing. And here's what I don't know if you remember Whitey Bulger. Most people my age would remember Whitey Bulger. And by the way, he was the brother of the Speaker of the House in Massachusetts. And the Speaker of the House in Massachusetts couldn't prevent Dan Burton from bringing his committee to Boston. And I'm going to guess, I wasn't there, but I'm going to guess he tried. So anybody that says you'll never get the Dan Burton Commission or the modern version of it to Providence, don't be so sure. And one of the things, somebody said, what bill would you put in first? I'm not sure that's my priority. I think I might have a conversation with somebody about bringing the commission to Providence. In case you've forgotten, Whitey Bulger was a crime boss. And
we're getting a little bit of feel.
The commission, but this is important to prove that this is the right approach. The commission smoked out 5 FBI agents on the take. Now, I was just a kid then, but I didn't like that. That was against my view of what this country is all about.
Well, the FBI has its own problems now, as we know, but I want to get into some other issues because we're at the halfway mark, and you know how time flies. What I want to do is, one of the other candidates is making a centerpiece of his campaign the banning of so-called assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. He's running ads. He says his is because his daughter was at a college where a mass shooting occurred, and, quote, no parent should have to wait by the phone to know if their child is all right.
By the way, I think there was 1 shot fired in that particular episode.
Whatever, but I mean,
that's what he said, yeah.
Correct, and that is his issue for the thing. Where do you stand on the Second Amendment?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm a Second Amendment supporter, and I think our Constitution needs to be respected, and the idea that you can change things by kicking over the Constitution is probably a wrong approach, and it's usually an ineffective approach. I'm not going to tell you that there's no such thing as a threat from weapons and school shootings. We know that that's happening. We probably exaggerate it. Somebody says, this is a country where there are more shootings. Would you like to try to live through World War II? We didn't live through World War II on this continent, and probably there's a reason for that. So let's use real statistics. We don't want anybody shot. But the problem that we have is that there are some irresponsible people misusing firearms. The biggest way to prevent this from being solved is to lie about it or use the wrong vocabulary. And every time a firearms owner or a responsible Second Amendment supporter hears the word assault rifle, he knows that who's ever talking about it is either ignorant or lying, because there are no assault rifles on the streets of this country. And we could talk a little bit about what an assault rifle is, but you can't use the wrong terminology, the wrong vocabulary, and make any progress, especially if you're dealing with a sensitive issue. If you really want the problem solved, talk about, tell the truth, talk about the reality of the problem, break it down into its components. It's not one problem, it's a bunch of little problems. And probably the quickest way to get an answer, and I'm talking about people I know. If you brought in all the gun club members in the state of Rhode Island, these are not stupid people, and you said, okay, we're going to trust you, and we're not going to cancel the Second Amendment. Bring us a piece of legislation that'll solve this problem. You'd probably have that legislation in a week, and it would be really solid. But they will not join on to any program that they think, rightly so, is just a first move in taking away all firearms. And when any other candidate, and I'm not going to mention his name, but if that candidate says, I got a program to pick up firearms, or I got a program to raise the age, or take away 20-round magazines, I've gone to some receptions and some fundraisers where I've talked to the people that are advocating this. They will tell you they want all the firearms. They want 320 million firearms. What is the likelihood and when can you accomplish it, even if it were a good idea? You can't do it. So essentially what you've got is a built-in failure. I don't want to see legislation introduced that's got built-in failure, because clearly to firearms owners and to me, we are heading, the intention is to take away all the firearms, and that is just a step towards authoritarian regime. There are a few other steps happening, but that's the biggest one. And why would you want to do that? Let's use the right terminology and get a new committee in there and get a piece of legislation that they like and the rest of us can support, and it'll get the job done. We can get the job done in a couple of weeks if we're honest about it.
The southern border.
I'll bet you could write that bill, Richard, because you are not stupid and you know the situation.
Literally, millions of illegal immigrants have poured into our country ever since President Biden declared our southern border open. And the people are coming not only from Central America, but from Venezuela, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Somalia, Iraq, and many other countries. And clearly they're not walking here across the water to get into this country. Now, what are we going to do about this? Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas says, oh, no, the border's fine, everything's good. But even we have mayors of cities that have been declared sanctuary cities, most of them, I think all of them, controlled by Democrats. They say, oh, we're overwhelmed, and the governor of Massachusetts wants people with a spare bedroom to open up their house to an immigrant. What are we going to do about the southern border?
Well, she's making a point, because I don't think she doesn't really think that the migrants are going to be put away, housed in spare bedrooms. I think she's making, but I think it's a valid point. You probably know that every major city on this planet has a U.S. consulate. It's basically a business office run by the State Department. It deals with commerce and any other thing. It doesn't do treaties, but it does commercial issues and immigration. And the French have relaxed a little bit. But a few years ago, if you want to go to France, you had to go to Boston and get a visa, which means they write in your passport, it's okay to come for this period of time. And if you're here longer, look out. And we could learn a lot from France, because you do something wrong in France and you're going to be sorry. And that's not true here anymore. But what I would like to see is, let's put this is what we used to do. If you're proposing to come to this country, you go to a U.S. consulate. If you're in dire straits of some type or in danger, we should buy you the airplane ticket. And we should bring you over here and make sure that you have what you need, the job, the education, the house, whatever, and care for your kids if that's involved. But we sure as heck ought to know your name. And that's not happening now. And the only way to change that, we got to close the border. And we don't have to necessarily close it forever. We could close it for a couple of months. And when you close the border, here's what you're going to do. You're going to save the lives of the poor 50 guys who got jammed into that truck that was owned by a coyote and died of asphyxiation in the heat, or you're going to save that mother and daughter who drowned trying to cross the Rio Grande. It's not, I'm not sure there's a legal term. I think there is, but it's attractive nuisance, but that doesn't cover. This is much bigger than a nuisance. But if you're encouraging somebody from South America or Middle America to make that long trek, maybe assisted by somebody who doesn't have, who's got a lot of money and doesn't have the interests of this country at heart, but you're basically saying, we're gonna let you hurt yourself. You're gonna die of thirst in the desert. You're gonna drown in the Rio Grande. You're gonna die in a truck. And while you're at it, by the way, we're counting on the fact, or we're aware of the fact, that you're gonna import some drugs that's gonna kill 100 or 150,000 Americans, fentanyl. That's a big problem, but close the border and it stops. And I don't want to, let's have another debate, somebody telling me that you can't close the border. We can close the border.
We've got about 5 minutes, and I want to focus a minute on the Sabina Matos campaign. One of her centerpieces is how she led the fight for women's reproductive rights, is what they're calling it now. The General Assembly, as you know, passed a bill that Governor McKee signed into law that basically protects abortion on demand in Rhode Island. But are you pro-choice, and would you support the passage of a National Abortion Rights Act?
This, I was there a long time ago when the Roe v. Wade decision came down, and I like to quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I'm pretty sure that everybody knows that if she had been in the Supreme Court a year and a half ago, she wouldn't have gone along with what they did, which was repeal Roe v. Wade. But she did say some interesting things, one of them being, it was the wrong thing legally. It didn't make any sense in the Constitution. She said that. If I'm wrong, call me up, show me the passage. But she said that. She also said that there's a conversation that needs to happen on any big social issue. And Roe v. Wade prevented that conversation from happening. I think the other thing she said was a little less controversial. She said this wasn't for mothers, this was for doctors. And I think she's right on all counts about those things. My view is that every single abortion is a tragedy, and I think what we really need to do is move our whole society and our moral values back into an understanding of what it really is, and let's not hide it. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody should go to jail or that it would be a doctor or a mother. I'm not sure that, in fact, I am pretty sure that I would not advocate for that. But I think we need to have that conversation that we skipped over 50 years ago, and we haven't done it. And one of the things, the word pro-choice or pro-life, these are tricky words, and they've only kind of represented the split in this country. And I think it's time to bring some unity and maybe get some new words.
President Biden, as you know, is proposing forgiveness of part of the student loan debt. The Supreme Court has said you don't have the constitutional right to do that. They're trying to find a workaround. If elected to Congress, would you support a bill that would forgive student loans, or a portion of them?
If you handed me the next 10 bills, I probably would have to say, this doesn't work. But the idea is valid, but there's something else you have to do too. You got to find the mechanic with $4,000 worth of tools for his, for being a diesel mechanic, or the kid that just started out a plumbing business and he's got a $50,000 truck. You can't leave him out of the equation. And it's very complicated because basically it's free money. And free money is effectively the seed of inflation. And we're going to have endless inflation unless we understand where the money's coming from. You can do anything you want if spend $1 million, tax $1 million. But if you're not honest, spend $1 million, borrow $1 million. It doesn't work, and we're going to pay for it. The two, and I might need to check this because it's been a couple of years since I read this, but the two empires or cultures or countries that succeeded most and had the fastest growth in economy were Venice, which had a huge shipbuilding economy and a merchant fleet, and the Ottoman Empire. They were the two empires in history that didn't borrow money. They were also the most successful growth. We stop borrowing money. We tell the voters the truth about what we're going to spend the money on and where it's coming from, because every cent we spend comes from you. That even goes for health care. We change that, our economy takes off. If you think it's good now, look what happens when we stop having inflation and stop lying to the people. And by the way, if you have time for a footnote, I know you don't, but I've got to say this. Inflation Reduction Act, the title is a lie. Read the act, and to any person who voted for that or uses that terminology, don't lie to me. And I think that's the problem out there in voter land. They've been lied to so much. Read the voter, it might be about some good stuff, which includes climate change. It's got nothing to do with inflation reduction. If you read it, it's inflation increasing.
Well, it's really the Green New Deal. So, last question. The Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity is running ads in the paper, and their last one said, people ask their candidates this question: should parents have full rights to direct the education and health of their children? How do you answer this question?
In principle, of course, but you can't necessarily, you've got to take into account the fact that if some parent is making bad health decisions, there might be an intervention necessary. But in principle, especially in cultural things or things concerning values like books or that type of thing, we're not going to reorient our values based on progressive policy, or we'll destroy the Democratic Party and the school system and the country all in one shot. We got to stop doing this.
We want to thank you, Spencer Dickinson, for coming on State of the State once again. It's been great to see you. And we want to remind our audience that we are now in voting season, and the primary is September 5th for the 1st Congressional District. If you live in that district, by all means, get out and cast a ballot and consider Mr. Spencer Dickinson as your candidate. Thank you, and please watch the next edition of State of the State.